Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and drop your thoughts below, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about grief, family, and the face of innocence. The church smelled of lilies and candle wax. The air was heavy, thick with whispers and the uneasy rustle of black clothes. On the altar stood a young girl with trembling hands, holding a folded paper that quivered like her breath. Her name was Sarah Grace Patrick, 17 years old, quiet, soft-spoken, and now the only surviving daughter of Kristen and James Brock, a well-loved couple found murdered in their home on Tyus Carrollton Road in rural Georgia. The crowd watched her with pity, some with tears, others with admiration. She was the grieving child, the one who found the courage to speak at her parents' funeral. Her voice was small, almost breaking as she began. "I loved them. I really did. And I'm so sorry." Those last words, "I'm so sorry," would echo for months in the minds of everyone who heard them. At the time, no one understood what she meant. Some thought it was sorrow, others believed it was guilt. Only later would investigators realize that this sentence, buried in a sea of grief, might have been her confession. The funeral ended with sobs and embraces. But for detectives sitting quietly in the back pew, something didn't feel right. Sarah's tone wasn't quite grief, it was restraint. It was like she was performing a version of sadness she thought people expected to see. Just a few weeks earlier, the same girl had called 911, her voice trembling, telling the dispatcher she had found her parents dead inside their home. It was February 20th, 2025, a chilly Georgia morning when a neighbor first noticed something strange. The front door of the Brock's home was left ajar. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken glass. No footprints in the mud. Just silence and the bodies of Kristen and James Brock lying cold on the floor. Kristen was 41, a teacher, a mother known for her kindness. James was 45, a hard-working man with a steady reputation in the community. Both were shot clean, deliberate shots. Execution style. Nothing about the scene screamed burglary. It felt personal. But when Sarah called police, her story was simple: she had been out, she came home, she found them dead. She sobbed through every interview, every question. The deputies pitied her. She was young, traumatized, seemingly destroyed by what she had seen. They promised they would find whoever did it. And she promised to help. For months, the case was cold. The small town of Carroll County began to heal, or at least tried to. The news faded. The cameras stopped coming. But Sarah didn't stop talking. She started reaching out online to true crime bloggers, TikTok creators, and YouTube investigators. She wanted their help, she said. She wanted justice for my mom and stepdad. At first, people sympathized. A grieving teen trying to find answers in a system that had failed her. But soon, her messages became strange. She'd send them photos from the scene that weren't public. She knew details police hadn't released. One influencer later said, "It was like she wanted me to dig, but not too deep. Like she was trying to direct the story." Behind the scenes, detectives were doing their own digging. Phone records. Search history. Gun residue tests. Each piece told a different story, a story Sarah wasn't telling. The weapon used in the killings was a handgun registered to her stepfather. It hadn't been stolen. It hadn't been sold. It was still in the house, wiped clean, but not well enough. The prints were smudged, but a faint partial matched Sarah's thumb. Still, it wasn't enough. Circumstantial. Suspicious, yes, but not proof. Then came the text messages. Hundreds of them. Conversations between Sarah and her friends in the weeks before the murders. Talk of arguments with her mother. Anger at her stepfather. The feeling of being trapped. One message, sent just 5 days before the killings, chilled investigators. "Sometimes I think it would just be easier if they were gone." No one took it seriously then. Teenagers vent. Teenagers say dark things when they're hurt. But after the Brocks were killed, that line looked like a storm warning everyone ignored. By April, the investigation had shifted quietly toward Sarah, but no one told her. She continued to post online, crying on live streams, begging for answers, tagging local police departments and crime accounts. Her follower count grew. So did her confidence. She thought she was fooling everyone. But police were patient. They knew that time reveals cracks. And the biggest crack came in June, when detectives subpoenaed her phone's cloud data. Among photos of pets and selfies, they found a screen recording dated February 19, the night before the murders. It showed a video of Sarah practicing with her stepfather's gun. Her face lit by the blue glow of her phone, whispering, "You never listen to me." Then, cut to black. When they confronted her in July, she didn't cry. She didn't run. She walked calmly into the sheriff's office and turned herself in, flanked by an attorney. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. The same girl who gave an emotional eulogy months earlier now stood accused of killing both the people she claimed to love most. The sheriff, standing before the microphones, said it plainly. She fooled a lot of people. But the evidence doesn't lie. Sarah Grace Patrick was charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Her bond was denied. And the younger sister, the little girl who had found the bodies that morning, was placed into protective care. The community of Carroll County fell silent again. No one could understand how the story turned so dark, so fast. How a grieving child could become the prime suspect in her parents' murders. In the courtroom, reporters said Sarah's face never changed. No tears. No emotion. Just the same calm she had at the funeral. The same faint sadness that could have been guilt or something colder. Her attorney claimed she was innocent. That the confession tape was misinterpreted. That the evidence was circumstantial. But deep inside, even the most sympathetic eyes in the crowd began to turn away. Because when detectives replayed that eulogy, when they listened again to the way her voice cracked on those final words, "I'm so sorry," they realized she hadn't been talking to the crowd. She hadn't been talking to God. She had been talking to them. Kristen. James. Her victims. And now, as she sits in a cold Georgia cell, awaiting trial, the question still lingers like smoke in the air. Was it rage? Was it control? Or was it something darker, a calm decision from a girl who had been planning it all along? Whatever the answer, one truth remains chillingly clear. Sometimes the most haunting killers are the ones who cry with us, smile at us, and tell us they loved their victims, right before pulling the trigger. The morning after the funeral, detectives returned to the house on Tyus Carrollton Road. The sun had barely broken through the fog when they unsealed the front door. The crime scene had been processed weeks before, but there were still unanswered questions, small details that refused to fit the narrative Sarah had given them. The air inside was stale, heavy with the faint metallic tang of dried blood. The furniture was untouched. A half-empty mug of coffee sat on the kitchen counter, long gone cold. On the dining table, a stack of school papers, Sarah's handwriting, sprawled beside a folder labeled financial aid forms. Money. College. Freedom. Words that could ignite teenage resentment in any home. Kristen's purse was still open, her phone inside. James's wallet was on the counter. Nothing was stolen. It was as if the killer didn't come for possessions, they came for people. Detective Mark Ellison, a 20-year veteran of the Carroll County Sheriff's Office, moved methodically from room to room. He had seen enough domestic murders to recognize when something didn't add up. The Brocks weren't random victims. They were chosen. And every trail seemed to point back to the same direction, inside the family. Sarah's 911 call replayed in his mind. Her voice had been calm. Too calm. She said she found them after coming home from a friend's house. But the timeline didn't fit. Her friend claimed Sarah never showed up that night. She had texted to cancel around 8:30 p.m., saying she wasn't feeling it. The coroner's report estimated the murders happened between 9 o'clock and 10 p.m. At 9:42 p.m., Sarah's phone went silent, no texts, no calls, no movement on GPS. For 2 full hours, the device stayed stationary in one spot, inside the house. Then, at 11:56 p.m., a message was sent from her phone, "Just got home." Something's wrong. I can't wake them up. That was the moment she called 911. Ellison leaned against the wall, eyes locked on the living room carpet where the bloodstains had long been scrubbed away. This wasn't panic, he whispered. This was precision. He turned toward the family photos lining the hallway. The Brocks looked like a portrait of Southern comfort, smiling faces under Christmas lights, matching t-shirts on beach vacations, Sarah with braces, holding her baby sister. But in one photo, slightly newer, something stood out. Sarah stood apart from her parents, her arms crossed, her smile forced. Behind her eyes, resentment. To the casual observer, it was nothing. To Ellison, it was motive. The deeper he dug, the more cracks appeared. School records showed Kristen had recently grounded Sarah for skipping classes. James had taken away her car keys. Friends told detectives that arguments at home had become constant. Kristen wanted discipline. James wanted control. Sarah wanted out. And then came the news no teenager wants to hear: her parents planned to send her to live with relatives out of state for the summer. She called it banishment. Her mother called it protection. What they didn't know was that Sarah had already found her own form of freedom. Weeks before the murders, she began researching firearms. YouTube tutorials. Cleaning guides. How to remove fingerprints. How to stage a burglary. In her search history, detectives found the words: how long before gunpowder residue fades from hands? And how to make a murder look like suicide. They found deleted messages to a friend. I can't do this anymore. I hate them both. Her friend had brushed it off as teenage frustration. But the house, silent now, seemed to hold on to every word she'd ever said within those walls. Every slammed door, every tear, every whispered threat. Forensics had already pulled DNA from the gun handle, enough to link Sarah to it. But the question remained: what was the trigger? What pushed her from anger to murder? The answer, as Ellison would later learn, was buried in a letter found inside Sarah's desk drawer. Folded neatly, dated February 17, 3 days before the killings. It read: Dear Mom, you always said I'd thank you one day for being strict. Maybe I will. But right now, all I feel is hate. I feel trapped. I feel like you've ruined everything. If I could start over, I would do it without you. There was no signature. Just those words, cold and unrepentant. When confronted about it, Sarah didn't deny writing it. She just shrugged and said, teenagers write things when they're angry. But even she knew how hollow that sounded. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of her online activity. True crime TikTokers replayed clips of her crying on camera, analyzing every tremble, every tear, searching for deceit. Some called her a victim of police overreach. Others saw through the performance, dubbing her the Carrollton actress. For Ellison, the hardest part wasn't proving she pulled the trigger, it was understanding why. There was no evidence of abuse, no drugs, no psychosis. Just a perfect storm of anger, defiance, and calculation. The night before her arrest, Sarah stayed up posting old family photos with captions like "I miss them every day." When deputies came knocking the next morning, she didn't protest. She packed her phone, looked at the officer, and said, "I figured this was coming." She was handcuffed on the porch, barefoot, her little sister watching from a neighbor's house. The town of Carrollton fell into a daze as the image spread across social media, the once grieving teen, now the accused murderer. In the interrogation room, Ellison sat across from her. He expected tears, confusion, denial. Instead, Sarah was poised, her hands folded neatly on the table. When he slid the evidence folder across to her, the letter, the video, the text logs, she stared at it quietly for several seconds. Then, in a voice that sent a chill down his spine, she said, "You already decided it was me, didn't you?" He didn't answer. She leaned back, her expression calm. "You think I'm a monster," she said softly. "But you have no idea what it was like in that house." He pressed. "Tell me what happened, Sarah." But she just smiled faintly and looked at the one-way mirror. "They'll never believe the truth," she whispered. Not the real one. That statement would become the cornerstone of her defense, that there was more to the story. But if she hoped to earn sympathy, it backfired. Because to the public, the evidence was overwhelming. To the court, it was enough for murder. And to the detectives who walked those blood-stained floors, one thought kept repeating in their minds. If the house could speak, it would tell us the truth. But the only one who still knows it isn't talking. The courtroom was cold. Not in temperature, but in spirit. Every whisper, every cough, echoed like a thunderclap. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters tapping their pens, waiting for a glimpse of the girl whose face had already become a national headline. Sarah Grace Patrick, once the grieving daughter, now the accused murderer, sat beside her attorney, expressionless, calm, unreadable. The prosecutor began with the timeline. The murder weapon. The digital trail. The eulogy. Piece by piece, they constructed the story the world thought it already knew: a teenage girl pushed by resentment, cornered by rules, and consumed by rage. But Sarah didn't flinch. Not once. Detective Ellison took the stand first. He described the investigation step by step, how the 911 call had triggered a chain of suspicion that never stopped tightening. How Sarah's behavior had been consistent with knowledge of the crime scene. How her social media activity seemed more like manipulation than mourning. The defense objected to everything. She's 17, the attorney argued. You're treating her like a cold-blooded killer when she's a traumatized child who found her parents dead. You can't criminalize grief. But Ellison's reply silenced the room. Grief doesn't wipe fingerprints from a gun. The crowd murmured. Sarah kept staring straight ahead, her face a blank wall. Not guilt. Not fear. Just silence. Behind her, a small figure sat clutching a teddy bear, her 6-year-old sister, the one who had found the bodies. She wasn't allowed to testify, but her presence alone pierced the courtroom like a ghost of innocence lost. The prosecutors never looked her way. Sarah didn't either. Outside the courthouse, news vans painted the parking lot in chaos. Commentators debated her motive, her mental state, her smile. Was she a manipulative sociopath or just a product of neglect? America couldn't decide. Europe watched with morbid fascination. True crime channels flooded YouTube with theories, thumbnails showing Sarah's face split in half, half angel, half devil. But inside those courtroom walls, the truth was far more fragile. Because even with mountains of digital evidence, there was one thing police didn't have: a confession. Every interrogation, every strategy to break her calm failed. The same phrase haunted the investigators each time she was questioned. I didn't do it. No tears. No emotion. Just that sentence, repeated like a line rehearsed too many times. But Ellison knew the silence wasn't innocence. It was armor. In his experience, killers talked too much. They tried to explain. They made mistakes. Sarah didn't. She said just enough to sound human, but never enough to help. Then came a twist no one saw coming. A forensic analyst discovered that Sarah's phone wasn't completely wiped. In a cloud backup, a voice memo had survived unlabeled, undated, but recorded the night of the murders. The clip was only 18 seconds long. It began with silence. Then a single gunshot. Then Sarah's voice, shaky, whispering, I didn't mean to. The courtroom gasped when it was played. Her attorney objected, claiming the file's timestamp couldn't prove it was from that night. But the prosecutor pressed on. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't the voice of a stranger. This is the voice of a killer realizing what she's done. Sarah blinked hard for the first time. Her hand twitched, gripping the table edge. But she said nothing. Later, during a recess, Ellison approached her quietly in the holding room. He didn't bring notes. No questions. Just presence. You want to tell me what happened, Sarah? He asked. Her eyes met his. For a moment, the mask cracked. A tear rolled down, the first anyone had seen since her arrest. Then she whispered, almost to herself, they were never going to stop. He leaned closer. Stop what? But she didn't answer. She just closed her eyes, and the wall came back up. To the outside world, that small moment meant nothing. But to Ellison, it was the key to understanding her. Something had been happening in that house, something no report could fully capture. It wasn't just anger. It was pressure, suffocation, fear. But was it enough to justify murder? The prosecution didn't care about the why. They only needed the how. The gun. The fingerprints. The messages. The video. The jury didn't see a child, they saw calculation. They saw a girl who went live on TikTok 3 days after her parents' funeral, crying for attention instead of justice. And yet, in the corners of that courtroom, some still believed her. Her grandmother wept quietly, whispering prayers. A former teacher testified that Sarah was a good student, quiet but kind. Her best friend broke down on the stand, she was scared of them sometimes. I don't know why. She'd say things like, "They're trying to control my whole life." But she never said she wanted to hurt them. The defense clung to that. They painted Kristen and James as strict, overbearing, maybe even emotionally distant. But the prosecution countered, strict parents don't deserve bullets. By the third week of trial, the case had divided the nation. Half saw Sarah as a cold manipulator. The other half saw her as a broken teen who snapped. But the truth, whatever it was, remained locked inside her. In closing arguments, the prosecutor held up the printed eulogy from the funeral. She said she loved them, he told the jury, his voice heavy. She said she was sorry. But when you look at the evidence, you'll realize that what she meant was, "I'm sorry you caught me." The jury deliberated for 10 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell into total silence. Even the reporters held their breath. The foreman stood, papers shaking in his hands. On the first count, murder of Kristen Brock, guilty. On the second count, murder of James Brock, guilty. Aggravated assault, guilty. The verdict hit the room like thunder. Sarah didn't move. Her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder. Her little sister began to cry softly in the back row. And as deputies led Sarah away in cuffs, she looked over her shoulder, one last glance at the gallery. Her expression was empty, but her lips moved silently. Some swore she said, "I told you so." Others said it was, "I'm sorry." No one could agree. The truth, like everything else about Sarah Grace Patrick, remained just out of reach, hidden behind that calm teenage stare that fooled an entire town. Outside, rain began to fall over Carroll County, washing the dust off the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions no one could answer, and for Detective Ellison, standing alone under the gray sky, one thought refused to leave his mind. If she didn't mean to, why did she pull the trigger twice? The small county jail cell was a cold, fluorescent world of echoes, metallic clanks, distant murmurs, and the occasional slam of a heavy steel door. For 16-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick, it might as well have been another planet. The quiet of confinement wasn't peace, it was the kind that screamed. After her arrest, the local media pounced. The headlines were merciless: Georgia teen turns on her family, the daughter behind the gun. Photos of Sarah in her school uniform flooded the internet, her soft eyes contrasting sharply with the accusations tied to her name. Inside the cell, Sarah sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at the concrete wall. She wasn't crying anymore. She had run out of tears. The world outside was raging, but inside, everything was heavy and still. Detective Paul Jensen visited her 3 times that week. Each time, she looked smaller, more fragile, but her voice was calm, deliberate, like someone fighting to believe their own story. "I didn't kill them," she whispered. "I just found them like that." Jensen wanted to believe her, but the inconsistencies were haunting. No signs of forced entry. The gun from the family's safe, Sarah's fingerprints. The timing of her 911 call, suspiciously delayed. Every piece of evidence tightened around her like a noose. Then came the interrogation tapes, the ones that would later go viral across social media. "Sarah," the detective said softly, leaning forward, "you told us your stepfather was drunk that night. Did he hurt your mother?" Her eyes lifted for the first time. "He always did," she said, voice trembling. But she wouldn't leave him. The silence that followed that confession was louder than any scream. The case shifted overnight from a cold-blooded double homicide to a possible self-defense narrative. But prosecutors didn't flinch. They called it manipulation, a desperate attempt to twist sympathy. She was angry, not afraid, they argued in early hearings. She planned this. Meanwhile, classmates described Sarah as sweet but quiet, artistic, and withdrawn. Her teachers remembered her as the girl who always sat near the window, sketching when she thought no one noticed. None of them could reconcile that quiet teenager with the one now accused of murder. When the news reached her grandmother, the only surviving family member willing to speak, she told reporters through tears, "Sarah's not a monster. She's just a broken child who grew up in a house full of shouting." That statement cracked the case wide open emotionally. What kind of home had Sarah really lived in? Was she the villain or the product of years of hidden pain? Investigators began revisiting old police calls. Neighbors had reported disturbances, loud arguments, screaming, sometimes late into the night. But no one had ever intervened. One neighbor, when interviewed, said chillingly, "I used to hear the stepfather yelling, sometimes glass breaking. I guess we all just assumed it wasn't our business." Now, those ignored cries became the backbone of Sarah's defense. Her lawyer, a soft-spoken public defender named Maria Alvarez, argued that the system had failed her long before the murders ever happened. She was a child living in constant fear, Alvarez said in court. And when fear becomes unbearable, sometimes survival looks like guilt. But prosecutors had no intention of letting empathy cloud the evidence. The crime scene photos, ballistic reports, and timelines painted a ruthless portrait, one that left no room for mercy. The town was split down the middle. Half believed she was a victim who snapped. The other half saw her as cold, cunning, and capable of anything. As the weeks dragged into months, Sarah's trial became a national obsession. The courtroom filled daily, locals, reporters, bloggers, even podcasters chasing the next viral angle. Each headline drew the world deeper into the tragedy of a family destroyed from within. And yet, amid the chaos, Sarah sat expressionless, a ghost of herself. Sometimes she stared at the ceiling during testimony, as if watching a story about someone else entirely. But the biggest twist was still ahead. Because just as the prosecution was building its final argument, a piece of digital evidence, one no one had noticed before, surfaced from Sarah's phone. A single video. Recorded the night of the murders. A video that would shatter everything the public thought they knew about the Georgia daughter behind bars. The courtroom was electric that morning, packed shoulder to shoulder with journalists, true crime bloggers, and small-town residents who'd come to witness the girl they once pitied, now branded a killer. The air hummed with tension as the defense attorney, Maria Alvarez, stood with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. She had something new. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady but sharp, "the defense has recently obtained a piece of evidence that could alter the very foundation of this case." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." Maria lifted a small flash drive. "It's a video from Sarah's phone. Timestamped the night of March 8, the night her mother and stepfather were found dead." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor's face tightened, he hadn't seen this coming. When the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, everyone leaned forward. The shaky footage showed a dimly lit living room, the Patrick family home. Sarah's voice could be heard crying, pleading. "Stop. Please stop." Then came the unmistakable sound of her mother sobbing, followed by a man's drunken shouting. "You think you can walk out on me?" A loud crash, then silence. The next moments were chaos. The stepfather, Michael Patrick, appeared in the frame angry, glassy-eyed, clutching something metallic. Sarah's mother screamed his name. Then came a single gunshot. The camera fell. The video ended in static. For several seconds, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed frozen. Sarah, sitting motionless at the defense table, stared at her hands as though she couldn't bear to relive it. The prosecution scrambled, insisting the clip was inconclusive. "We don't see who fired the weapon," the district attorney argued. It's chaotic. This could still support our case. But the public had already made up its mind. Within hours, the video leaked online. Millions watched and shared it under hashtags like #JusticeForSarah and #TheGeorgiaTruth. The same world that had condemned her now wept for her. Interviews flooded the news. Domestic violence advocates spoke out, calling Sarah's story a tragedy of systemic failure. Her school counselor broke down during a live interview. "I knew something was wrong," she said, "but she always said she was fine." The prosecution tried to regain control, digging deeper into Sarah's mental state. They pointed to her calm demeanor during the investigation, calling it chilling emotional detachment. But it was too late. The narrative had shifted. The world no longer saw a murderer, they saw a survivor. Behind bars, Sarah received letters from strangers, women who had lived through abuse, teenagers who said she gave them courage to speak. She read every one. Some made her cry. Others made her wonder if freedom was even possible for someone who had lost everything. Then came the forensic revelations. The ballistics team re-examined the gun. The angle of the bullet wounds didn't match Sarah's height. It supported her claim that Michael had turned the gun on himself after striking her mother. The timeline fit. The evidence aligned. When the results were presented in court, Maria Alvarez's voice trembled slightly as she said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you've just seen and heard is not the story of a teenage killer. It's the story of a young girl caught in a storm she didn't start and one she barely survived." Sarah looked up for the first time in weeks. Not at her lawyer, not at the cameras, but at the empty space where her mother should have been sitting. The prosecution, cornered, requested more time to re-evaluate the case. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Public sentiment had flipped. Every major network covered it. TikTok flooded with short clips of the video and courtroom reactions. A hashtag even trended globally, #FreeSarahPatrick. Still, the judge wasn't swayed by noise. "The court will review the new evidence thoroughly," he said sternly. "But let it be known, the truth always demands its day." Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered with candles, holding signs that read "Believe Sarah" and "Protect Our Daughters." Reporters crowded the steps, and the small Georgia town that once whispered about the murder girl now spoke her name with sympathy. But behind the newfound public compassion, something darker lingered: questions about the justice system, about how a girl had to nearly die before anyone believed her story. As Sarah sat in her cell that night, the moonlight cutting through the bars, she whispered the same words she'd told detectives months before. "I didn't kill them. I just found them like that." Now, finally, the world was beginning to believe her. But the fight wasn't over. Because the final verdict, the one that would decide whether Sarah Grace Patrick walked free or spent the rest of her youth behind bars, was still to come. And when it did, it would shock everyone. The final day of the trial felt like a storm waiting to break. Reporters lined the courthouse steps before sunrise, their breath fogging in the cold Georgia morning. The entire country was watching. The story of Sarah Grace Patrick, the teenager once painted as a murderer, had become a mirror reflecting America's deepest questions about justice, abuse, and survival. Inside, Sarah sat in silence. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a folded note, her mother's handwriting. The police had returned it weeks earlier, found inside a drawer. "No matter what happens, I love you, Sarah. Never stop fighting." It was all she had left. The courtroom buzzed as Judge Harper entered. The jury had deliberated for 17 hours. Every camera turned toward the teenager who had gone from grieving daughter to accused killer and now stood on the edge of freedom or forever. Will the defendant please rise? Sarah stood. The world seemed to stop breathing. The forewoman, an older woman with tired eyes, rose slowly and spoke. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Sarah Grace Patrick, not guilty. The room exploded. Gasps, tears, applause. Even the judge had to call for order. Sarah's knees buckled, and her attorney caught her before she fell. She didn't cry at first, she just stood there, stunned, as if she couldn't quite believe it was over. But then the tears came, years of fear, pain, and loss pouring out all at once. Maria Alvarez held her tightly. You're free, Sarah. You're finally free. Outside, the courthouse steps became a sea of people. Strangers hugged, some cried, others cheered her name. The same media that once called her the Georgia teen killer now hailed her as the survivor who changed everything. In her first and only public statement, Sarah faced the cameras and spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I lost my family, my childhood, and almost my future. But I never lost the truth. If you're living in fear, speak up. Someone will listen. I promise you. Her words rippled across the internet like wildfire. Overnight, she became the voice of a movement. Nonprofits were formed, domestic violence hotlines saw surges in calls, and legislators began proposing new protections for abuse victims in Georgia, laws unofficially dubbed Sarah's Law. But while the world moved on, Sarah never truly escaped the shadows of that night. In interviews years later, she admitted, freedom doesn't mean forgetting. It just means learning how to live again. She left Georgia quietly, enrolled in college under a new name, and never sought fame or attention. Occasionally, journalists would catch whispers of her living somewhere along the coast, working with at-risk youth, teaching them how to paint, helping them tell their stories before they turned into headlines. And though the cameras turned away, one truth remained: the system failed her before it ever tried to save her. The story of Sarah Grace Patrick wasn't just about murder, it was about how silence can kill long before a gun ever does. Because behind every closed door, there's a story no one wants to hear until it's too late. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this video, because somewhere, a voice like Sarah's is still waiting to be heard. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more real-life crime stories that uncover the truth behind the headlines. Every view helps bring light to the darkness, and together, we can make sure no one else becomes the next Sarah Grace Patrick.